Okay, thank you very much, Robert, for the kind introduction and also for the opportunity to present. I guess nod your head if you can hear me and see my slides, because I just want to make sure that, okay, good. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. That would have been, of course, the best way, the most desirable way to do this, but thank you to everyone who is attending today and taking time on your Sunday to listen to my lecture. So as Robert mentioned, I will be talking about immoral work and markets for immoral work. But I would also like to use this opportunity to a bit more broadly say something about the interactions between moral concerns and markets, of which this research that I'm doing on immoral work is a part of my research agenda. So let me take the liberty of kind of changing the title slightly, even though I will discuss the things that Robert mentioned in his introduction, to kind of focus a bit more on just moral markets in general and what we can learn about morality and markets by looking at labor markets. So I'll digress a bit in this general direction, and then later on come back to talking about morality and labor markets and immoral jobs in particular. So the reason for discussing this is that, of course, markets are present in many domains of human life, right? Where we work, where we study, what we consume, all of these things are determined in some form or another through interactions and outcomes that are determined by market processes that determine prices, that determine wages. And so markets do have a great impact on our lives and on society. And partly as a result of this, over the last decade or so, there's been a lot of attention to what extent are markets something that are actually capable of moving us forward when it comes to promoting moral concerns or moral values. And there's been a great deal of debate over this. That perhaps two prominent examples are a paper published in Science by Armin Falk and Nora Seck that argue that markets corrode moral values and that they greatly diminish them. And then a well-known book by Michael Sandel that discusses precisely this question of what are markets good for, and often makes the case that markets are not good for valuing and exchanging things with an inherent moral value. And part of the reason for both of these arguments is that markets are perceived or can be shown to, at least in some cases, diminish concerns for morality. And so these claims are made that market exchange somehow, when it involves something that has an inherent moral component, erodes or diminishes this morality. But is this really the case? And so what I'm going to push back on in the lecture today is some examples from my research, which will also focus on labor markets, to where we can see clear evidence that when we look carefully and look at the right types of situations, markets very frequently have a strong reflection of our moral values. And our moral concerns, things like morality, show up quite strongly in market outcomes. And an example of this will be in the context of work and certain types of work that we avoid because of its perceived immorality and what this means for the outcomes in those labor markets. Moreover, the way in which morality operates in markets is in a very sensible way that's consistent with what we assume as economists is how markets work and how preferences get displayed through markets. So when it comes to choosing to do certain jobs or avoiding certain types of jobs for moral considerations, it'll behave in the same way that other attributes of work, like not wanting to work long hours or late night shifts or in risky professions, works. And so again, we see that morality is something that shows up in market outcomes if we look in the right ways. And at the very end, I hope to have time to discuss some recent research we're doing, showing that markets can actually be a tool for promoting values that are associated with morality or moral concerns. So let me get right into it then, and start off by talking about moral goods or in product markets. So is it the case that we fail to see moral concerns in market context? My guess is that most of us can already think of things that we do when we purchase as consumers that reflect some concerns for morality. So there are a lot of types of products out there that are labeled or promoted or have as a quality or an aspect of the product itself, something that we can think of as being related to morality, right? Fairness with respect to producers throughout the supply chain that are producing goods. Positive impacts on the environment, or the elimination of cruel practices with respect to animals, are all things that have a moral component. And when we look out at markets around, when we go to the grocery store, when we shop online, we very frequently see products that have these types of attributes. But I do think this raises a question of whether or not these are really moral goods, right? Is it really the case that fair trade is a good that is different than other goods solely in the dimension of morality? So I can go and look at bananas at my store and see that there are fair trade bananas. And they may differ from other bananas that are not fair trade, but is that really the only distinction? And when I pay more for fair trade bananas, or when consumers pay more for fair trade bananas, does that really reflect a concern for morality? This question is very difficult to answer when we're looking at real product markets, because there may be other reasons. Maybe fair trade bananas taste better. There may be other considerations why they may be priced higher, why consumers may buy them despite the higher price. And so, as is the case when we get to looking at amoral jobs, what we can learn from looking at the real world and existing markets is helpful and valuable, but we can also learn a lot by bringing things into laboratory contexts where we can control a great deal more. And so what I've been doing in a lot of my research over the last several years is looking at moral goods in laboratory markets. So in economics, we study behavior often in laboratory settings where we can recreate the key aspects of a real world market or context that we're interested in, but stripping away all of the stuff that's unnecessary. So in the case of our experiments, we bring people in, we tell them, you can buy a product, it's worth 50 to you, 50 points, which are experimental currency units. At the end of the experiment gets translated into some amount of real money. And if you buy any product, it's worth 50 to you. But there's two types of products, right? There are moral products, let's say, that have no impact on another participant, or in some cases, no impact on a charity. And then there are immoral products that produce a negative impact. In much of the work I'll show you, it's a loss of 60 points on another experimental participant or a charity. And so now what we've been able to do is create exactly this dimension that we're interested in, the morality of a product. But it's not as messy as comparing fair trade versus non-fair trade products in the real world. It's been simplified to really vary only in this dimension. And so as a participant in our experiment, you see these products, you see different prices, you see different types of products, much in the same way that you would see when you arrive at the grocery store and look on the shelf, and you can choose to accept one type of product. You can choose not to buy anything and keep your money in the same way that consumers actually do. Right? And the key thing, again, as will be the case when we look at work, is that in this in this case where we're trying to model consumer choices, the two products are otherwise identical, except for their prices and this moral impact that they have. They don't differ in any way. And what we're interested in is, what products do people purchase? And what we find is that there is a substantial and persistent market share for these moral products in a laboratory setting, where we can say the only thing that differs with these products, even though they cost more, is that they are more moral. And the fact that these products exist in the market and persist, and that people continue to pay for them over time and essentially give up their money to support these moral products, tells us that moral concerns are something that can persist in markets. And so we've really been able to isolate this moral dimension as a key product attribute that can be sustained in a market context. And then we can look at and see whether or not it responds sensibly to economic factors. Right? As we change things that economists say should matter, does it actually change and behave in that way? Much like if we were going to change economic factors with respect to other types of products, with respect to electronics or automobiles, we would expect certain things to happen. So for example, as the production cost of the moral product increases, what we see is a decrease in the market share, which is shown by the red line, of these moral products. Right? So basically making them more costly to produce relative to the non-moral alternative means that they have a lower market share, which means they're responding sensibly to economic forces in the way that we typically assume goods operate. Another thing we can look at is what happens as consumers become wealthier. Right? Most goods are normal goods, meaning that as as consumers' income increases, they buy more of them. That's true of housing, that's true of clothing, of many different types of things. Is it the case that morality as an attribute of a product is a normal good? And what we do in our experiment is we increase consumers' incomes, and we see that in fact they do buy more of these moral goods. And we can do it in the laboratory by varying only morality as the relevant dimension of these goods, and while also changing exogenously, right, randomly, the degree to which consumers have higher or lower incomes. And so this allows us to corroborate observations that we can see when we look at the real world. Like here, what I'm showing you is the relationship between the percentage of fair trade products that are purchased by consumers and GDP per capita across many countries. And we look both across countries and over time within countries, we see a positive relationship between income and the share of fair trade products. But in the real world, it's much messier, right? We don't know if fair trade products are really inherently only more moral than other products, or if there's other reasons why people are buying them. We also don't know if there's other factors that are both causing changes in income and other reasons why people may subsequently also then want to buy more fair trade products rather than, let's say, the income change itself being what's causally responsible. And so what we see here is that we can study moral concerns in markets by using these very simple laboratory environments and use them as a complement for what we observe outside the laboratory in the real world. We can also test whether the moral behavior in these markets responds sensibly to social and psychological factors. So for example, what happens when we give people the opportunity to discuss what the right thing to do is in these markets, when we allow them to form simple laboratory versions of campaigns where they can try to encourage each other to buy these moral products. What we see here is in experiments conducted both in Switzerland and China relative to a baseline condition in blue, where there is no kind of discussion or public discourse. 3 different versions of such discourse where people can engage in discussions before exchanging in the market that vary the specific conditions under which this operates, that I won't go into detail here in the interest of time. But what we see in all 3 cases is that we see more morality, more kind of moral concern in these product markets when in the presence of this discourse and the ability to form and convince others of the moral value of doing the right thing in these market settings. So again, we see that in these simple laboratory contexts, outcomes and behavior reflect a strong and stable concern for morality that responds sensibly to things to factors that we assume should matter. And so the first thing, to wrap up this first line of research, we can see fairly clear evidence that when people make the claims that markets are inconsistent with morality or that market exchange somehow erodes and eliminates morality, these examples that I've shown you here give us at least a counterpoint that where we see a clear reflection of moral concerns in market outcomes. Okay, so then let me turn to the more substantive part of today's talk, which is again going to be in the direction of morality in a market context. But now, instead of looking at the morality of consumer choices and of individuals deciding what products to buy, what I'm going to discuss is the morality or immorality of certain types of work. So let me start with a quote from Adam Smith, which is always if you can, that's always a good place to start an economics presentation or a discussion of economics, where he's writing about the exorbitant rewards of public performers like players, opera singers, dancers that are receiving high salaries. And he's arguing that they're founded upon the discredit of employing them in this manner. Right? At the time, these types of professions were viewed as somehow kind of morally corrupt or not really worthy of what kind of good people would do. And he argues that that's the reason why they obtain such high earnings. And then he argues that if public opinion or prejudice ever changed with regard to such occupations, their pecuniary recompense, these exorbitant rewards, would quickly diminish. Right? And the reason he says this would be the case is if they stopped being perceived as immoral or as being perceived as something that people frown upon doing, more people would enter these professions, and the competition would reduce the wages, reducing the price of the labor. And so what he's noting is that there are jobs that he's arguing are generally perceived as immoral. And as a result of this, there are people that won't do them, and the people that do them obtain these exorbitant rewards. Of course, he was writing about this centuries ago, and we wanted, in terms of thinking about the relevance of this for our modern world, we want to see, are there these types of professions that have some discredit associated with going and working in that particular line of work. And so part of what we did in what I'm showing you here is we conducted a survey where we went and asked 177 students at the two main universities in Zurich how immoral they think it is to work in several different industries. And I'm showing you here a listing of several of these industries. And what the x-axis corresponds to is the share that rated it as being either quite immoral or very immoral on this 5-point scale, right? So the proportion that thought there was some degree of immorality in these particular industries. And so what we can see confirms our general intuition and the perception that some jobs, some types of work that people do is something that has this widespread perception of being kind of immoral work. So working in the arms industry and tobacco and gambling are things that people generally say that's a type of work that I would perceive as being immoral. So this is simply reflecting this perception that was in the quote by Adam Smith, that certain lines of work have this association with the perception of being immoral. And so what does this mean, right? So again, going back to what I used that first part of the presentation to discuss, if markets are a good context for reflecting our moral values, then when we analyze it using the tools that economists have developed to study markets, we should be able to make predictions about what happens, about what drives outcomes in markets as work becomes immoral, and use those to see whether we find support for these predictions in the data. And so what I'm going to show you here is basically a way of representing two simple predictions that we test in our work about what happens as work becomes immoral, right? And so what the axes here correspond to are a standard supply and demand analysis of wages for working, the quantity of labor supplied, and the at a given wage, which will give us a supply curve for labor, and then the demand for labor, which is how much firms are willing to pay. And so assuming that the demand for labor for immoral and moral work is fixed, which is a simplifying assumption, but not crucially important in this analysis, what we can see is that suppose there was some regular type of job that didn't involve immoral behavior, like the ones towards the bottom of that graph I showed you on the previous page. And there was other work that was perceived to be immoral, right? Arms, tobacco, or gambling. What might we expect? Well, if people find doing immoral work aversive, if they have moral concerns, if they say, I don't like doing immoral things or things that as a society we generally agree are immoral, there are going to be more people that are going to be reluctant to do that type of work at any given job. And so we're going to have a retraction of supply, which means that supply at any given wage is going to go from the blue line to the green line. Fewer people are going to be willing to work, right? And so this is basically just a straightforward representation of what should happen in a labor market as work becomes more aversive. In this case, the green line reflects an aversiveness due to immorality. But the same graph could also apply to describing what happens as work requires more averse conditions or more dangerous conditions, right? So there's nothing kind of surprising in this graph in terms of a very simple economic theory that everyone learns in the first semester as an economics student. But it does mean that we can generate a prediction about what should happen if enough people find immoral work aversive and are willing to forego wages to avoid doing immoral things. The retraction in supply should lead to a new equilibrium with a higher wage. Right? And so we can generate a prediction that immoral work should command an immorality wage premium. These are exactly the exorbitant rewards that Adam Smith discussed in the quote I showed you earlier. And then something else should also happen too, which is if we look at the relationship between the blue line and the green line, right, people who remain employed in the immoral market are going to be the people who experience the lowest kind of aversion to the immoral work, right? Or find it least costly to be hired when more work goes from being neutral in the blue line to being on the green line. And so the second prediction we can generate is that those who are least concerned with morality should be disproportionately employed in immoral work when such work exists. And again, this is straightforward economic analysis of labor markets, where if we were to say that a job involves working late hours, the people who would be most likely to be employed in those jobs would be the people who find it least aversive to work overnight or to work the late shift. Right? In this case, though, the heterogeneity comes from an aversion to doing immoral things, where some people find it more aversive than others. And so what we would expect is that the people who remain employed are those who are find it least aversive to do immoral work. And so what we did in this study is we went and tried to see if we find evidence for these two predictions, right? There are wage premiums and there's differential sorting by different types of people, both in real labor markets and in laboratory markets where we can control a great deal more. So the first thing I'm going to show you is a graph that plots the degree to which an industry is perceived to be immoral, which is based on those survey responses that I described earlier, where we basically ask people for a bunch of different industries, how immoral do you perceive this industry to be, right? And so higher numbers here correspond to a greater perception that an industry is immoral. Against the average gross hourly wage reported from the Swiss labor force survey, which collects a representative sampling of the Swiss working population and collects their wages, the type of job they do, and the industries in which they work. And so what we see here is a positive relationship between the perceived immorality of working in a particular industry and the wages that are paid that people receive for working in those industries. This is just the raw correlation. We also find a significant relationship when we do regression analysis that controls for characteristics of the workers, like their age, their education, the region in which they live, and other factors as well as characteristics of the industries themselves, like size and number of employees and other things that may affect the wages that they pay. So the relationship between higher wages and perceived industry immorality persists even after we do this additional controlled analysis that accounts for more factors. So this suggests that what Adam Smith discussed centuries ago remains true, right? Industries in which there is this discredit or public perception that it's immoral to work in those particular industries seem to pay more. And so this is evidence from real markets that suggests that moral concerns are impacting outcomes, right? In the way that Adam Smith discussed, in the way that simple economic theory predicts, that if people find work like tobacco and weapons manufacturing aversive, enough people will say, I don't want to do it, or I wouldn't do it unless the wages were really high, which drives wages up. So this is again a manifestation of a concern for morality in people's behavior that is, in this particular case, manifesting itself in higher labor costs for firms working in these industries. However, looking at the graph on the previous page, there may still be factors that we can't account for, things that we can't observe or things that are not in our data that may drive the relationship. And so as much as we find that to be consistent with what Adam Smith proposed and with this hypothesis of a wage premium for immoral work, we need to be able to look more closely and see if when only the immorality of work varies, do we see the same thing in terms of higher wages? So once again, we turn to the control that we can generate in a laboratory where we can really fix things and vary only the immorality of work in order to try to test this hypothesis. And so what we did is we conducted a laboratory experiment, and I won't go through the details here because the details are quite, in some cases, a bit complex and would take a while to go through, but I'd certainly be glad to elaborate on any of these in the Q&A session at the end. What we did is we basically brought in participants into a laboratory experiment. At the beginning of the experiment, we obtained a measure of a participant's general concern for acting morally. Right? So this had nothing to do with work or a labor market. We basically gave them a simple task in which they could lie and make more money for themselves, but lying also harmed other people and harmed the charity. Right? So if you were willing to do that, we classified you as immoral. If you weren't willing to do that, we classified you as moral or neutral. We measured morality in a couple of different ways, and they correlate. So it's not just based on this, the things I'll show you are not based just on this one particular way of finding morality. The more important part of our experiment, though, involved creating this hypothetical labor market in our experiment, where these same participants were then given the opportunity in repeated rounds of this labor market to be hired as advisors who would provide a written recommendation to a client, right? The client was another participant who would be recruited in a subsequent experiment. And they could provide advice to these clients. If they were hired, they were told what advice they had to provide. Right? And so I'll show you in a second the form in which this advice took. But the key thing that this allowed us to do is to vary the type of work along only the dimension of morality. So in all the employment in our experiments, regardless of which experimental condition you were in, you were being hired to write a recommendation to a client. And the only thing that varied was whether this recommendation was moral or not. And to make work immoral, what we did is we created a situation where if you were hired to do immoral work, you had to tell a lie, something that wasn't true. You had to take an action that would subsequently harm the client, lead them to earn less money, and also take an action that would subsequently decrease the amount of money available for a charity that was being received money as a result of this experiment. Right? So the charity was UNICEF. It was a fund that funded malaria treatments for children. And we showed them materials from UNICEF saying that, malaria is one of the leading causes of childhood mortality, and that these malaria treatments are effective for treating malaria, and that the donations that were funded as part of this experiment would go towards providing these treatments. We framed it in the context of the number of treatments that a child would receive. And so this is basically the choices that a client would make later on. So the client was someone that was recruited later on subsequently. The client would choose between one of these 10 options, but the client didn't know anything about what was in the table, right? The client didn't know the outcomes in terms of treatments for children. Here we framed it as children saved. And options A through H and J all increased the number of treatments provided to children, right, via donation to UNICEF. Option I reduced it. Similarly, options A through H increased the payoff to the client, right? Whereas option I didn't give the client any additional earnings. And so what participants did in this experiment is they submitted wages at which they'd be willing to be hired to do work. And the work varied between immoral work and neutral work. And the only thing that varied was the specific recommendation. So in the neutral condition, you had to fill out a piece of paper by hand that read something like this, that basically looked exactly like this, where you entered your initials and a recommendation, right? In the neutral condition, you would have to recommend one of these options. We told them, if you're hired, you'll have to recommend option F, right? Well, option F is actually the one that produces the greatest donation to this UNICEF fund, and also gives the client the greatest money. So you're telling them the truth, but you're also telling them something they would probably find on their own anyway. So you're not changing outcomes that dramatically. As you've probably been able to guess, in the immoral condition, if they were hired, if they agreed to do a job, they had to recommend the one option out of the 10 that lowered the donation to UNICEF and also prevented the client from earning money from their participation in this experiment. So you had to lie, you had to harm the client, and you also harmed a donation to UNICEF. If you were hired, you had to write the recommendation that you were hired to complete. You couldn't change it, right? But you always had the option of saying, I don't want to do the work, right? Or submitting a wage request that was so high that you would never be hired. And so what we're interested in this experiment is, what wages do people ask for? And then what outcomes does this produce in our laboratory labor market? At the end of each round, you received fairly rich feedback that showed kind of how much, who was hired in each round in the market. You could see the identities of the other people in your market via photographs that we took at the beginning of the experiment. And you also could see how much money people had earned cumulatively over the course of the experiment. Right? And so we show them fairly rich information in the same way that you might observe your neighbors who work in the arms industry kind of driving nicer and nicer cars and expanding their house with additional kind of remodeling and additions and so forth, right? Okay, so let me show you then some results. Right? And so in this laboratory environment, we induced a labor supply, right? These were the actual kind of costs for working in terms of what you had to pay if you were hired to do a job. That's represented by this black dashed line. So in the neutral treatment, what does the labor supply actually look like? Well, it looks pretty close to the theoretical costs, the theoretical kind of labor supply curve. So in a sense, the theory works quite well in our experiment, to the extent that when work doesn't involve doing something immoral, people end up competing down to the wages that that the theory says they should be asking for in a competitive market. But what happens in the immoral treatment? Well, in the immoral treatment, people request a lot more money. Some people say, I won't do it for any amount of money, even 50 francs, which also reduces labor supply. Other people say, I'll do it, but only if I get paid substantially more. And so this reduction in supply causes a reduction, this aversion to doing the work causes a reduction in supply. And then what we see is that this, in fact, produces an impact on wages. And so what I'm showing you here in this purple line is the wages in the neutral treatment. And in the immoral treatment, what you see is persistently higher wages, right? These are the exorbitant rewards that Adam Smith wrote about in the context of work that has a discredit or immorality associated with it. But now we've been able to show this in the laboratory labor market using a context in which it's only the immorality of work that varies, right? It doesn't require separate skills. It doesn't require separate training. There's no kind of long-term risk of being out of a job because you're in one industry or another. Everything is exactly the same between these two, but we get this persistent wage premium. And note that the wage premium doesn't decrease over time. If anything, it's increasing. So it's not the case that as people get more experience, they start saying, okay, I'm willing to do the immoral work, or I'm more willing to go along with it. This aversion to doing something immoral in this laboratory labor market is strong and persistent and doesn't decrease over time, which again serves as a reflection of people's moral concerns. The fact that people say, I don't want to do this job that involves lying and harm is what produces this wage premium. And remember that I told you earlier that we did this initial task that allowed us to classify participants as either moral or immoral types. And so what I'm going to look for next is there a difference in terms of who gets hired in this market? Is it the case that the immoral types, the types that in this earlier task were willing to lie more for money, are the ones that end up being employed more in this laboratory labor market? And what we see is that for immoral work, right, the immoral participants are substantially more likely to be employed, right? Their employment rates for immoral work, using the simple classification from a one-time task at the beginning of the experiment, are between 80 and 90%, but the participants that we classified as moral or more concerned with morality are employed at much lower rates. When we look at the neutral condition, where work does not involve doing something immoral, what we see is that there's kind of no distinction between the two. Both types are employed at fairly high rates, almost 90% towards the end of the experiment, and there's no difference between the two types' employment rates. So it really is something about the immorality of work that's leading these different types to be employed at different rates. And the reason this happens can be illustrated in this simple graph here, which shows you what happened in one session, is that the person represented by pink and the person represented by green are more willing to do the job. They are more likely to have been the immoral types as classified earlier in the experiment. And the remaining 4 participants refuse to do the job, right? Even though they observe the other people accumulating substantial earnings over the course of the experiment, right? In this particular case, the pink person is earning close to 100 francs over the course of the experiment, and these other people are earning nothing additional to what they received for simply showing up. They nevertheless persist in saying, I will not do this work, I don't want to do this job, right? Which reflects a strong and stable concern for morality. Okay, so what we've seen here is in our laboratory labor market, we've seen these wage premiums for doing immoral work. We've seen this differential sorting into immoral work by more moral types, right? That doesn't occur when it's neutral work. And these effects persist with experience, right? Even when people observe these immoral other participants earning substantial amounts of money, they persist in saying, I don't want to do this work. And so we see this reflection of individuals' moral concerns in these market outcomes. In this particular case, the moral concern is an aversion to doing work that is generally perceived as immoral. So next, we want to look again at this question of sorting, right? And who ends up doing the immoral work and see if we can say something about real world jobs and where it is that people end up and what types of jobs attract different types of people. And so what we did is we asked participants in our study how willing they would be to work in various industries and firms. So these are hypothetical choices. These are university students, but we're asking them in the future, how willing would you be to work in the gambling industry, in the banking industry, in the hotel and restaurants industry, right? Different types of industries of that type, as well as about different large firms in Switzerland that we'd also collected ratings of perceived immorality about these specific firms. So what I'm going to show you is on the x-axis of this graph is the perceived immorality of the work. How immoral do people, other people rating these different industries perceive the work to be? And on the vertical axis, what I'll show you is the differential attractiveness of this work to moral types relative to immoral types, right? A higher number means that it's more attractive to people that were classified as moral based on this simple task that we have in our experiment. And what you can see is that jobs that are perceived as being more moral are also more attractive to people who are more moral in the context of their behavior in our experiment. And conversely, jobs that are widely perceived to be by other people as being immoral differentially attract people who are perceived to be, who engage in more immoral acts in the context of our experiment as well. We also did this with respect to firms, and what we can see again is that firms that are rated as being more immoral, or involving work activities that are more immoral, also differentially tend to attract or be more attractive to people who are less concerned with morality. Okay, so then let me quickly then just mention another line of research which is related to this question of morality in markets, and then I'll give some closing thoughts on kind of policy impacts and other things that matter when we start thinking about morality in markets, and particularly with respect to work. So we've seen that markets can reflect moral values, but I want to just kind of make the point that perhaps they can also shape and promote such values, right? To just give markets kind of the credit that they perhaps deserve when it comes to these discussions of morality. So let me give you a thought experiment. Suppose you have to buy an electronic device from one of two retailers, and the two products are otherwise identical. Retailer one is someone who shares your values on an important dimension. This doesn't affect the product, this doesn't affect any consequences, but it's just someone that you believe acts in a manner and holds values that are consistent with those that you yourself adhere to. And the other person opposes those values, right? They have a completely different set of values on whether it's politics, morality, or some other type of social issue. From which retailer would you prefer to buy? And would you be willing to pay more to buy from the retailer who shares your values? We asked this question to several online participants in a study, and what we found is that people prefer to buy from people who share their values, and are in some cases say that they'd be willing to pay substantially more. And they also are even willing to pay to avoid buying from people who have opposing or conflicting values. Now, these is just what people say they would do, but we also have experimental evidence that shows that they actually do these things. This is a thought experiment, but it's also something that we regularly think about. So a recent example is a campaign going on, which is actually affecting the movie choices in my own household, which is people say you shouldn't watch the movie Mulan because of the lead actress's comments regarding the Hong Kong protests in the past. So this is again a situation where people seem to be saying their market activity should reflect some type of moral concern. The thing we can go one step further and address, however, is what incentives does this possibility that people may withhold market exchange from you or not be willing to trade with you or be willing to pay more to go shop from someone else if they don't share your values, what impact does this have on the values that you then publicly adopt, right? And you can think about then the incentives for retailer two. If there are enough consumers who share your values, the second retailer may also then say, I no longer want to publicly impose those values, and I may publicly support them as well. And so I won't spend time on this since we're short on time, but what we did is we just simply conducted experiments both in the laboratory and online that provide support for these predictions. What we did is we varied whether or not there was a opportunity for exchanging in the market. And we allowed people to either make a donation or express support for some cause that was supported by buyers. And what we found was that when there was a market possibility, people were willing to change their public support for a cause, like a donation to a charity, in anticipation of the fact that other people would react by being willing to pay less for someone who opposes their values or has conflicting values. But when we took away the market exchange altogether, when we eliminated the possibility of market exchange, the support for those values went away, right? These donations decreased completely. And so what this is telling us is that the possibility of exchanging in markets is something that can fundamentally promote certain types of values, and particularly the values that your counterparts may have that you may otherwise ignore or not find important, but when it affects the possibility that you may interact with them in a market and how much they are willing to exchange with you, can lead to your promotion and adoption of those values. We also did this by eliciting people's responses about statements regarding policies with respect to human rights in China. And what we found is, again, that the possibility of market exchange increased stated support for the values held by these participants in the experiment in China. So the possibility of exchanging with someone can change your statement of support for certain types of values. I apologize for rushing through this quickly, but I realize I'm low on time. So let me return to kind of the broad point of this talk, and then say a few things about the morality of work and what that means. So what I've shown you is that there's ample evidence that moral concerns can be manifested in market outcomes, right? Our aversion to immoral work and the impact this has on wages for certain types of industries and on who ends up working in those industries are examples of this. But we also want to be careful when we talk about values and morality in markets. As I've shown you in these last studies that I went through very quickly, it also may potentially mean that certain values are promoted, and we want to attend to whose values those are and what impacts those values have on society. Right? It may not be the case that the values that markets are promoting are necessarily something that we all agree with, but we do need to be aware of the fact that markets don't just reflect values, but can also promote them. In the same way that refusing to do certain types of work is a reflection of your values as a potential employee that then has consequences in terms of driving up wage costs for certain types of industries, making those industries potentially more expensive. It also means that when we analyze what happens in market contexts, we need to be aware of the fact that these moral values, things like aversion to immorality or preference for moral goods, operate in the way that standard economic theory, or often operate in the way that standard economic theory says that they should. So as I've shown you here, we see wage premiums for immoral work. We see that the people least concerned for avoiding immoral activities end up sorting into this type of work, which is consistent with economic intuitions from centuries ago with respect to Adam Smith. And despite everything that we've learned about markets and how also about our moral preferences and moral behaviors, there's a great deal of this interaction that needs to be further understood and further studied. So in the context of immoral work, the fact that people who are least averse to going into immoral industries are the ones that actually go in and make decisions in those contexts may mean, for example, that those are the worst people from society's point of view to be deciding how many guns to produce, how much tobacco to market, and how many harmful products to make, right? We would want the moral types going into those industries, but that's not what we're getting. So thanks for your patience. I realize I went a couple minutes over, and sorry for rushing through the bit at the end there, but I'd be glad to hear any questions that you have about this research.